Greetings, everyone. Let me welcome you to Patrick Henry College. I'm Graham Walker, president of the college, and this is our Newsmakers interview series. It's a pleasure to welcome everybody who's here in the crowd today, also those who are joining us by live webcast. And of course, these interviews ultimately tend to get written up in World Magazine, where we're joined, therefore, in the experience by around 400,000 readers of World Magazine. Our interviewer, who has demonstrated his skill repeatedly in this series, is Dr. Marvin Olasky. It's a pleasure to have Dr. Olasky on our faculty as our Distinguished Professor of Journalism and Public Policy. He's also, of course, the editor-in-chief of World Magazine, and in that capacity, he informs a lot of the evangelical world about the goings-on in the public square. He's got a lot to say about that. Dr. Olasky has published any number of books and articles on issues of social philosophy and public policy, all from a Christian worldview perspective, which have been of great benefit, I think, to the whole body of Christ in America. And our students love to have you as a professor, especially in their internships with World Magazine. Today, we have the privilege of Marvin Olasky's interview with one of the most notable voices in American evangelicalism for the last several decades, Dr. Ron Sider. Dr. Sider received his Ph.D. from Yale and went on to teach at Messiah College in Pennsylvania at its campus in inner-city Philadelphia. While there, he observed severe poverty and racism to which suburban Christians were seemingly indifferent. This, I believe, inspired him to write Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger. The book sold 350,000 copies and was hailed by Christianity Today as one of the most influential religious books in the 20th century. He also wrote Good News, Good Works, which exhorts the church to embrace the entire Bible through evangelism, social engagement, and spiritual formation. He's written over 30 books total, including Completely Pro-Life, a book called Living Like Jesus, and others. He founded the organization called Evangelicals for Social Action, a think tank seeking to develop biblical solutions to social and economic problems. He's also a founding board member of the National Religious Partnership for the Environment and is the professor of theology, holistic ministry, and public policy at Palmer Theological Seminary in Wynwood, Pennsylvania, near Philadelphia. Dr. Sider is also an ordained minister in the Mennonite and Brethren in Christ churches and has lectured at many educational institutions. We're delighted to have you and Marvin Olasky here with us today.
Well, thank you all for coming. It's a real privilege for me to be here with Ron. We occasionally have some political disagreements.
Once in a while.
But I really do esteem Ron as a person who believes strongly in Christ, has continues to live a life that shows his faith, and a very honest and thoughtful Christian. Regardless of our political differences, I just hold you out. I hold him out to you as just an example of how to live a life dedicated to Christ. So anyway, thank you for your 40 years since founding ESA and so many other good things there. And let's go back now to early on. You were born in September 1939 in Ontario, 275-acre farm. So tell us about farming and tell us about being a hockey player.
I grew up on a farm. My dad was selected by lot to become a preacher as he was a full-time farmer. He only went to grade 8, so it was important for his children to get high school. I discovered that I liked all of that, and so I went on beyond high school. But I loved the farm, and every Canadian boy almost plays hockey, and I loved to play, which I did all through high school, even though I had to wear glasses, and we didn't have helmets, but they flew off, but I never got my eyes poked out.
And wearing glasses then did not hurt you in hockey playing the way that my poor eyesight hurt me in baseball. You were still able to shoot and skate.
Yeah.
And
it was only 100, it was a Christian high school, so 100 students, so you didn't have to be really good to be on the team. But yeah, I played forward and loved it.
Okay. And then you went to Waterloo Lutheran College and your thought was to become a high school history teacher, perhaps?
Mm-hmm.
And then something changed to increase your ambition.
Yep.
Not that there's anything wrong with being a high school history teacher, mind you.
I just discovered I liked school, and so I decided I should. I was making very good grades, but my third year I decided I needed straight A's because I wanted to get into a good grad school, and I was grateful to God when that happened.
And a person who some of you have met because he occasionally is here at Patrick Henry and teaching, John Warwick Montgomery, had a big influence in your life, I understand it.
In my first year in college, it was a nominally Lutheran school, but really it was a secular. It was essentially secular by then. In my first 2 years, I was struggling with whether or not I could be an honest thinker in the modern world and still believe in historic Christianity. John Warwick Montgomery came in as my major history professor, or one of them, in my last 2 years, and his whole apologetic grounded in an historical argument that the evidence is really quite good. If you don't begin with a philosophical bias against the possibility of miracles, the historical evidence is quite strong that Jesus really was alive on the third day. And that was very important to me intellectually, and I continue to use that kind of apologetic in certain circles.
And so as you're going to college and then graduate school at Yale, what is your developing view of government and how trustworthy and efficient it is in trying to carry out certain public purposes?
Well, I don't think that I had a very sophisticated view of that at that point in my life. I did have a developing sense of call in the latter part of my years, 6 years at Yale, to encourage the evangelical world to be engaged in issues of social justice. I thought especially of racism and economic justice. White evangelicals were at best silent and often on the wrong side during Dr. King's great crusade. And we had a black landlord and landlady the last 2 years in New Haven, sat with him the night Dr. King was killed, was developing a sense of the tragedy of racism in American culture. So I was beginning to have a sense of call to help evangelicals become engaged in those kinds of issues. It's over the last 40 years that I've developed, I think, a somewhat more sophisticated answer to the question that you've given.
Okay, so at that point, the federal government, in terms of the civil rights movement, is really a good guy in trying to bring things along and improve circumstances. So there would be a situation in which you would say, here the federal government's doing the right thing, it's promoting certain virtuous objectives, and is being successful actually in pushing this along. How did the Vietnam War affect your thinking about the role of government? Now again, you're coming at this as a Canadian, but you're living in the United States at this point.
Yeah, I was never deeply engaged in the whole struggle about the Vietnam War, so that probably didn't factor in a major way into my thinking. I would now say, with regard to the government, let me just one step back. Any issue that I want to try to deal with, I try to start with a biblical framework. I think for any issue of public policy, every person who thinks about it, whether they're conscious or not, start with some kind of normative framework. And I want to start with a biblically informed normative framework. And when you do that, it seems to me, you want to say two things, basically, about the role of government. One is that government should be limited. I think there are two basic reasons for that. There's a positive reason, a negative reason. The positive reason is that God created every person in the image of God, and we're all called to be stewards and to shape the created order if all the decisions are made by a few powerful people, then most of us can't fulfill our creation mandate, and we can't shape history the way God intends us to. The negative reason is sin. In a fallen world, you concentrate power, and you get totalitarianism. Concentrated, unchecked power will always be used for the selfish advantage of the powerful. So government must be limited. But the other side of what I think the Bible says is that government has a positive role, not just in making sure that the judicial system runs fairly, although that's important, but also to empower poor people, to step in if there's need and people are hungry, but especially to empower people. I like to say that my basic definition of economic justice comes from going back to the Old Testament, an agricultural society, looking at what happens to the land. When the children of Israel move into the land, a few wealthy people don't own all of it. The government doesn't own all of it or much of it. What you have is every family getting its own land, a fundamentally decentralized economic system. And then the prophets shout and scream in the time of the kings when a few powerful people are sometimes by legal trickery, sometimes just in other ways, but they're getting the land and the poor people don't have the resources. And the prophets say the country is going to go into captivity because of this economic oppression and idolatry. But they say sometime in the future the Messiah comes, and when the Messiah comes, everybody sits under his own vine and his own fig tree. They've got their land again. So my principle out of that, my brief definition of economic justice, is that God wants every family and every person to have access to the productive resources so that if they act responsibly, they can earn their own way and be dignified members of their community. Now, I think it's a very important role of government to try to set up frameworks and structures and measures that, in fact, enable people to have that genuine access. I'm not interested in welfare programs that create dependency, although I think if people are starving, we ought to feed them. But I think a central role of government is, yes, limited, but yes, to do the things that we needed, the government alone can do, or some of the things that only government can do, to in fact empower poorer people.
So let's say a farmer has a 275-acre farm, and biblically instructed, he and his employees do not get every last crop. They leave the corners of the field there for people to come and glean. Mm-hmm. And if they have fruit trees, they leave fruit on upper branches. People have to work to climb up. People have to work to glean. Mm-hmm. But it's there, and so no one's going to starve. Yeah. A system like that encourages charity on the part of the landowner. He isn't maximizing his economic advantage. He's leaving some for people to work and glean. It also creates a certain sense of thankfulness among the people who are gleaning, thankfulness to God. Mm-hmm. I mean, perhaps also thankfulness to the farmer. Mm-hmm. They have a bond created between them. Isn't that a better situation where you might have a cheerful giver and a cheerful recipient rather than a grumpy taxpayer and a recipient who is annoyed that he has to actually perhaps work to get something?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you talk about that in your Tragedy of American Compassion. And I think you're half right, that the side that you just talked about is really important. And I think it's better for private programs helping poor people to require work, some kind of contribution. It's better for their dignity, and it's better for their own sense of not falling into a dependency. The other side that I think, if I may say so, you is the structural side. I mean, there are structural causes of poverty. With African Americans, it was slavery and then a history of racism. They didn't get their 40 acres and a mule. The way white farmers, the government wisely, when white farmers moved across the country, didn't have huge plantations. They in fact divided. Every farmer could get his own land. That was a great measure of economic decentralization. But Native Americans, African Americans, and on and on. There are structural problems that also need to be wrestled with. And I would say, with regard to specifically the Old Testament, the Old Testament not only says one that God doesn't like poverty and God wants it ended, but it also says some people are poor because they're lazy, and that's wrong. They should work hard. And it also says not only that you let the edges of your fields be gleaned by people who are poor, but that every 50 years the land goes back to the original owners. So there are structural mechanisms which presumably the rulers were supposed to carry out that would in fact make sure that you didn't get a situation that goes on indefinitely where the land is more and more concentrated. A few people have all the basic capital, which is what land is in an agricultural society. So it's not just you can glean, but at the Jubilee you get your land back. And at the sabbatical every 7 years, even though if you've had to fall into slavery because of poverty, you're freed with resources to earn your own way.
So thinking about structural problems, agreed that that slavery and then the continued economic subjugation of lots of African Americans was terrible. A lot of that has changed, certainly since the 1950s and the 1960s. That subjugation doesn't exist anymore in that form, except for, would we agree possibly that a huge structural problem in American society right now is the public school system and the lack of vouchers, so that lots of people in inner cities, and often particularly minorities, are trapped in terrible schools and don't get what they need then to advance economically?
I think one of the huge injustices is precisely the dreadful schools that large numbers of African Americans, Latinos, and poor whites have to go to in our great cities. I've lived in lower middle class, interracial sections of Philadelphia for most of my adult life. I've seen people striving hard to make it. If you compare the kind of quality education that white suburbanites get with what large numbers of inner city African American Latinos get, it's simply absolutely outrageous.
And what if you compare the education that some inner city people get in good Christian schools compared to what they get in their local public school?
Yeah. Catholic schools and some other evangelical schools. Unfortunately, too many of those evangelical schools were started, because they didn't like the end of racism in the South. But there are also good schools that, in fact, do help minority kids, and they often do it on less money and are more successful. So in my chapter on education, in my book, Just Generosity, A New Vision for Overcoming Poverty in America, I say not only is it absolutely intolerable to have this ongoing dreadful education for so many urban kids, and it's wrong to be spending a lot more money per person on white suburban education than on city education, and that's still on balance the case. But also, we've got two proposals for overcoming the awful educational system today. One is reform the public school system, and the other is vouchers. And I say, I don't know which is finally better. I certainly don't know enough to say, let's go this way completely. But I say, Catholic schools at lower cost are having such success that we ought to at least have a big test. So let's spend 5 years. Let's take the very best reform the public school proposals, and let's test those in a dozen different kinds of school districts, big cities and smaller, and let's take the best educational voucher approach, and let's test that. Whichever works better for minorities and poor folk, I'm in favor of. Now, I do have a hunch that the vouchers would work better, but I don't know enough to say we should go that way. It is striking to me that precisely teachers' unions are afraid to have the test. It's also striking that, at least in some polls, the people who most in favor of vouchers are African Americans between the ages of 25 and 35, precisely with the kids. But let's at least have a major test, and let's do what's best, especially for poorer people. But one part of it is certainly going to have to be to correct the injustice where wealthy white suburban districts spend vastly more money per person in their educational system than inner city African American kinds of communities. I mean, if white evangelicals would say that's wrong and immoral and we demand equal money being spent across the state, that would make a difference. But they're not doing that.
Okay. Let me continue with that voucher question then. Your hunch is that the vouchers would work better. I mean, it would be good to have an experiment and actually see, but that's your hunch. What about in the areas of social services? For example, in fighting drug addiction, I've seen that a lot of places, including Teen Challenge places and others, do a much better job in fighting drug addiction at a much lower cost than government-financed operations. Would you be in favor of extending vouchers in social service areas? And if so, what areas do you think that would be most effective?
Yeah, well, let me start that by saying that I can blame you or give you the credit to some extent for my voting for George W. Bush in 2000.
This is a shock.
Dr. Olaski, as I'm sure you all know, played an important role in persuading the governor of Texas to embrace the idea of compassionate conservatism. And I genuinely hoped that here we had a Republican who really cared about the poor, who would come up with a different set of proposals and say those silly Democrats don't know how to do this, they always mess it up, but we Republicans care as much about the poor, and we're going to do it in a better way. I have to say I was disappointed. Although I do think that President Bush did a very important thing in his White House office and the whole emphasis on really expanding charitable choice so that private faith-based organizations could access government money. I think he did a great job on that. I knew all of the heads of that office and was enormously supportive. I'm delighted whenever we can get private agencies to do more to deal with social needs, poverty, and so on. But it seems to me totally impossible for a couple of reasons for those organizations to take over all of that. There are about 5 federal anti-poverty programs. If we were to privatize all of those things, each congregation would have to add about $1.5 million to its budget every year. Now, maybe your congregation can do that, but mine can't, and most couldn't. Lawndale is a marvelous example of huge 30 doctors or more, tens of thousands of people every year cared for in a Christian, private medical program. But almost all their money comes from the federal government, from Medicaid. Or to put it differently, we have thousands of Christian organizations in churches providing food aid. But all of those private agencies provide 5 or 6% of all the food aid every month. 95 or 94% comes from government. So yes, as soon as Christians are willing to be more generous, and expand their programs, I'm eager to have them take over more of those kinds of social services, because I think if you deal with the whole person, the body and the soul, you get better results. But one, Christians are too selfish and they don't give enough to do it. And two, the needs are so vast that it's totally out of the question in any kind of foreseeable future, like 5-10 years, for government to step back and let private agencies do it.
I want to come back to vouchers in a minute, but let me just let's talk about the funding for a minute. I think we'd agree that one of the inequitable things is that if people give money to charitable organizations, if they're at a very low tax bracket, then it's going to be they may get nothing off their taxes in a sense for, or maybe they'll get 15%. Other people will get 30%, 35%, getting close to 40%, and so forth. Plus, I mean, state taxes kicking in. Wouldn't it be better to have an across-the-board tax credit of perhaps 50% for everyone giving to charitable groups, rather than have this smaller and deviated amount?
I must confess I haven't thought about that, but my initial reaction is yes, absolutely. Even with the present system, I'm opposed to President Obama's wanting to cut off at a certain level, the tax deduction for people who give to charitable causes. I think that's a mistake. We want more institutions in private society, not less. But I like your idea.
So, I mean, that, and this was one of the things that we talked about a lot in the Bush campaign, and once going to Washington, I mean, the thing with the tax credit is that it's decentralizing. It removes a substantial amount of power from Washington, because individual taxpayers then are making the decision about where they're going to send money. And once people get elected to Washington and have power there, there's a great reluctance to give it up. So that's one of the things that just happened. But if you could have a tax credit system which would thus increase the finances flowing from individuals to organizations, then maybe those organizations could do a lot more than they have been doing, giving up some themselves, but the federal government having less revenue for those purposes. And then you extend the voucher idea from schools into social services and possibly into medical care as well. I mean, let's talk about that a little bit, since that is such a pressing issue right now with Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act, or as some people refer to it as the Unaffordable Care Act. What would you do, and maybe you're being called upon to offer some advice in this situation. President Obama clearly is in a bad state right here. He's being reviled for having made promises and which clearly the federal government is not keeping. What would you advise him right now to try to get out of this mess where he now resides?
You know, I don't pretend to have a quick, brilliant answer for all the complicated problems in Washington.
Well, let's have the type of thing that I like to propose, a slow, stupid answer.
Let me start a couple steps back.
Okay.
It seems to me that we've had a situation, still do, although hopefully it's changing, where 50 million or so Americans, poorer Americans, have no health insurance. The studies are clear. They don't go to a doctor as quickly. They don't get as good care. They die younger, and so on. And it seems to me that's fundamentally immoral. It seems to me health insurance for every person is a pro-life issue that every evangelical ought to be insisting is absolutely crucial in their political engagement. I don't see how you can be committed to the sanctity of human life and not say that health care, which in fact preserves one's life, isn't a crucial concern.
Let me just mention there that let's say there's the requirement that all individuals should have access to health care when they're having health difficulties, and that should be across the board. which is not quite the same thing as health insurance. I mean, we've had, in a sense, had that system, a very inefficient system involving emergency units of hospitals and so forth.
Yeah, and everybody agrees that the current system, people argue that everybody has access. The truth is they don't go as early,
Sure.
and it costs more. So it's bad for them and it's bad for all of us. So we need
it's a miserable
better.
system, right?
I mean, I would like to see a really serious Republican proposal that says everybody in this richest nation in history must have access to quality health care. And here's how to do it. We don't have that. Absent that, I've been supportive of the basic move of the Affordable Care Act to say we're going to at least have 30 million more people covered. I find it absolutely abominable that the provisions in that act, which would make millions of additional poorer people across the country be able to get Medicaid, and therefore much better health coverage. Southern states where evangelicals are most dominant are precisely the states that are not accepting that Medicaid. Now, if they had a better proposal and said, we're going to cover all those people and here's a better way to do it, that would be one thing. But it's just not there. And I find that simply flatly ignoring one of the most important things that the Bible says, that God's on the side of the poor and God measures societies through what they do to the people on the bottom.
Well, but extending you're saying if you find vouchers useful and your hunch is they would work educationally. Could you extend that to the field of medical care? And if Republicans are more likely to desire a decentralized approach like that, what advice would you give them as far as ways to do it that are biblical and that work within this decentralized understanding of wanting individuals and communities to do more and the federal government to do less?
Well, I would say, show me the plan, and I may be excited about it. But it's also true that, the Affordable Care Act, at a certain level, works with vouchers. I mean, every person, depending on their income, gets a substantial amount from the government so that they can go out on the exchanges, and they've got some choices. I wish they had more, but in some states, a lot of choices, and they can buy this or that program. So that's not totally devoid of a voucher kind of approach.
Well, but isn't the problem right now, the political problem that President Obama is facing is because it's not really a voucherized approach in that he promised that people would be able to keep their doctor and their medical plan, and people are finding out, millions are finding out they can't do that. So, again, if he were to turn to ESA or to you and say, what must I do to be saved at this point from my political problem, and in a way that's consistent with the Bible, how would you advise him?
Well, again, we have thousands of brilliant economists and health specialists who struggle with how to improve this system. And as a Christian theologian and ethicist, I don't pretend to have, that kind of detailed, sophisticated answer. I simply, I don't get paid to do that, and I don't have the expertise.
Above my pay grade, too.
What I'm clear on is the richest nation in history ought to have a system where everybody has access to genuinely quality health care, and that's not there, and that's immoral.
Okay. Should the government require that everyone be in a plan that covers contraceptives and abortifacients?
No, I'm appalled. I was very upset with that part of the implementation of the act. Joshua Dubois, who's a good friend, he was the head of the White House office of faith-based initiatives, and I know Josh fought hard inside the Obama administration against that particular proposal. That was a totally unnecessary battle. That was, I think it was contrary to any proper reading of religious freedom. That was a mistake. But Marvin, I want to take us to another part of the current scene, which I think is really crucial, and that is that at this point in time, the country is more divided economically, or to put it differently, the extremes between the top and the bottom are worse than at any time since the Great Recession, just before that, 1928. This country has less economic mobility. It's harder to move up from being poor to being middle class or whatever than in Western Europe at this point in time. The richest 1% in 1928 were getting about 28% of all the income in the country. In the period of the 50s and 60s, when the economy was growing faster than it has in the last 30 years, they were down to 10%. And the upper tax rate was higher. It's very interesting to compare the 1950s to the 80s to the 80s and the present. But from 1993 to 2007, half of all the income increase, half of all the increase in the income in the whole country went to the richest 1%. From 2003 to 2009, 65% went to the top 1%. And in the last couple of years, about 93% of all the increase in income went to the top 1%. I think that conservatives ought to be worried about that. That's a centralization of power. Conservatives used to be good in the 80s when it was the Soviet Union and you had economic and political power centralized. They were right. I agreed with them. That was a dangerous centralization of power. But we've got economic centralization of power, and the rich buy the election, so it's political and economic centralization. I would think that conservatives ought to be worried about it now, just as they were when it was the Soviet Union. So, where are the conservative proposals for correcting a fundamental injustice where so much of the wealth of the country goes to the richest 1%, more and more, and they use that power to want to cut food stamps, want to cut Pell Grants that enable poor kids to go to college so that they can have the access to knowledge, which is the basic capital in our society.
Yeah, we've interviewed Charles Murray here and talked with him a lot about this at various times, and he certainly connects the this economic dislocation, and I think you're right. I mean, your statistics, I think, are largely accurate about the 1% and so forth. He connects a lot of that with education and the very terrible education that we're agreed that lots of kids get. He associates it with family and marriage, and people who are raised in single-parent situations have a harder time breaking out of poverty. So you look at some of those basic dislocations, and then you wonder why some of those dislocations occurring. You wonder about education, and I think we're agreed with the difficulties there. And in fact, we're even partially agreed with the solution of increasing educational choice. You look at the question of two-parent families, and I think, Murray would say, I suspect you would agree from your own observation that the welfare system has not been helpful as far as family formation, and may even have hurt it very severely, because often people have enormous economic problems, or their finances get worse if they get married. There are advantages to being unmarried, and that tends to lead to more kids being brought up in single-parent situations. So how many of these problems that we see, including the 1% and the 99%, how much of it is generated by business activities, and actually how much of it is generated by very poor centralizing governmental decisions that try to make things better but actually end up making things worse? In some ways, I'm wondering if our different perceptions are, maybe you grew up with a certain faith in government and faith that good hockey players would win, and I grew up with the Boston Red Sox during their losing years. So,
that might be a bit reductionist, but
a bit.
I think that there's no doubt, but that the poverty that we have in this country is caused by a whole bunch of factors, and one big one is the breakdown of wholesome two-parent families.
Which government has had some contribution to it?
Some, undoubtedly. But it seems to me there's also an economic side.
Okay.
In 1970, more or less, the minimum wage would get you out of poverty. Today, the minimum wage doesn't get even close to getting you out of poverty. So it seems to me another part of genuinely reducing poverty is to say we ought to agree that anybody who works full-time responsibly ought to get, I would say, 25% above the poverty level and have health insurance. Now, we're not even close to that. We have millions of people working full-time and not getting out of poverty. We could do things. We could increase the minimum wage some. We could increase the earned income tax credit some. We could make some of the child assistance and so on programs refundable that are not. And in that way, make sure that anybody who works responsibly would get significantly out of poverty and have health insurance. Partly, we can't do it because we've got a deficit and debt problem. And if you look at the causes of that, the three major causes are, the Great Recession a few years ago, and two unfunded wars under President Bush, and huge tax cuts that went largely to the richest 20%. So, I mean, those are the three major reasons we don't have the funding that would enable us to somewhat increase some measures which are linked to work responsibility so they don't create dependency, that would in fact help people at the bottom get out of poverty if they work responsibly.
You know, one thing that liberals and conservatives have often been able to agree on is the earned income tax credit, EITC, because then you're paying people to work. You're not paying people not to work. I suppose the problem is people discuss, and we'll go to your questions in just a moment, but the problem is people discuss minimum wage often is whether in order to help people be on the ladder and rise up if you're cutting off the bottom of the ladder. And that's an agreement, that's a disagreement that economists have as to what the impact of that is. Right. But we could talk about this a lot more, which is fun. And I think we could actually, on some things, come to some agreement on. So Ron and I could certainly, be the kings of the forest and everything then would be fine. But perhaps you would disagree, and in which case you may want to ask questions. Questions from any of you?
I have a question regarding the economic aspect of it. You talk about one of the major reasons why we have problems with these programs, we don't have the resources to throw at these issues, is things like unfunded wars and tax breaks and stuff like that. Relative to those causes that you brought up, how would you compare the unfunded liabilities of, say, Social Security and the closely related aspects of Medicare and Medicaid?
Yeah, well, those are really good, really important questions, and we have problems in both. I just recently, a few months ago, wrote a piece, said, I'm a senior, I'm mad, and I'm resigning from the AARP. And the reason was that the AARP was absolutely refusing to have even more wealthy seniors pay just a little more for a variety of things like their medical care, co-payment, and so on. I think that Social Security is more easily solvable than Medicare, because Medicare is part of the whole healthcare system, and for decades, virtually every year, healthcare costs generally, not just Medicaid and Medicare and VA, which are government-run programs, but the whole healthcare system has been, the cost has been increasing a lot more than the growth in income. And that's not sustainable. So we've got to figure out ways to reduce the increase, eventually get it down to no more than the growth in population and growth in inflation, increase in healthcare costs. I think that means we have to go more toward preventative care. We certainly ought to get rid of people going to emergency rooms rather than having preventative care. I mean, that's just stupid. I think evangelical Christians like myself ought to say we ought to have living wills to say we're a few months from death, and that's pretty clear. We don't want all the expensive procedures. About 25 to 28% of all Medicare costs are spent in the last year of life. And some of that's quite justifiable, but some of it is not. And doctors will do operations that make them money, and because sometimes relatives want it, even though the person is dying from other things, and there's no way to prevent that. And for some evangelicals to shout death panels when you've got a proposal just to pay doctors to have a conversation about that sort of thing, it seems to me is fundamentally immoral. But that's just one way that we would make some dent in the explosive growth of healthcare costs. I don't know all the things that we need to do, but we've got to get that under control. But the government-run programs are no worse than the others in terms of that escalating cost, which is out of control. In terms of Social Security, I would probably increase the amount that people at the bottom get. I would decrease or tax more the Social Security payments of more wealthy people who have a lot of additional income. And I would also tax for Social Security purposes dividends and capital gains. There are ways to make that sustainable. That's not an insoluble problem. The healthcare is a bigger, more difficult one.
Yeah, a lot of these solutions don't seem to have a lot of connection with what the real causes of poverty in this country. I mean, the fact is we don't have large numbers of starving children going around with distended bellies. Almost all of the poverty in this country, in the Western world, is caused by family structure.
It's caused by what?
Family structure. Most of this is these are the children of single-parent homes. And what happened to the Christian values of chastity and fidelity and marriage? What these children need are families, and they need fathers to teach them for moral as well as for economic reasons. And it seems like this is where we're missing in this whole debate on welfare and on poverty. These are the Christian values that we need to be setting forth, not tinkering with the welfare state.
Well, you're partly right. The collapse of wholesome two-parent families is a huge cause of poverty in this country. And the sociological studies make that clear. And it's still true that in some liberal circles, it's almost impossible to get folk to admit that correlation. And even harder to get them to accept proposals, governmental proposals, that would work at that, like making it more difficult for parents with underage children to get a divorce. I mean, that would be a sane kind of policy change. So I agree with part of it. But there's an economic side too, and there have been studies that show that when you have increased economic deprivation, recession and so on, you get more pressure on marriages and more divorces. It's also true that I think it's the average working person, working man, made more in real dollars in 1970 than today. Unions are vastly weaker, so the income of working people has not kept pace with the expansion of wealth in the country. And the economic side is also putting pressure on families. So we need to do a whole bunch of things. Our religious leaders need to persuade evangelicals not to get divorced at the same rate that everybody else does, for Pete's sake. That would be a nice start. And persuade us to keep our marriage vows. And that's absolutely crucial, and it's crucial to overcoming poverty. But so is the economic side. And I don't know why liberals deny one side and conservatives deny the other. why can't we see that both of those things are important and that we ought to make changes in both areas?
Susan, you have a question?
Y'all haven't talked about the collision course between sort of what's going on with gay rights and religious liberty. Could you talk about what you see happening over the next 5-10 years?
Yeah. Well, I'm a signer of the Manhattan Declaration, and I've been opposed to legalizing gay marriage.
And the Manhattan Declaration, let's explain, is?
It was a declaration that Chuck Colson and Robbie George at Princeton, who's a friend, and let's see, third key person, the Southern Baptist at...
Al Mohler, Timothy George?
No, George.
Yeah.
Were the leaders. But one of the three major points was to say that marriage is between a man and a woman. And I think that's important. I was opposed to the way that our society is going. I think we've lost the battle in terms of gay marriage, but I think that we will now face a huge battle over religious freedom. I worry about this immensely. I think that important parts of the society will be illiberal and not genuinely support choice, as they ought to, given the history of religious freedom and the slogan of choice, precisely championed by those people, so that faith-based organizations, religious nonprofits, Christian colleges, et cetera, ought to have the freedom to say our belief is that marriage is a man and a woman, and we don't hire people who don't share those views. But I'm afraid that there'll be a lot of pressure to cut off funds, maybe Pell Grants and federal aid to those Christian colleges, maybe even taking away the nonprofit status of organizations that take that stand. So there's going to be a huge battle. We ought to be able to win this. After all, there's a religious tradition in this country, religious freedom, a political tradition, and choice is supposedly a good thing. So, we've got the right ideals and slogans on our side, but it's going to be a battle.
Yeah, Ron and I are in agreement on the Manhattan Declaration. We both signed it, and let me just say that a lot of Christian colleges are going to be scrambling to be in the position where Patrick Henry College is, as opposed to many of them have grown dependent on the federal government, and sadly, it's going to be bad. There's going to be blood on the floor. So.
Hello, sir. You talked a little bit about wage reform and increasing the minimum wage. You talked about wage reform and increasing the minimum wage.
Yeah.
I just kind of had a question about the effects of that. When I was 16, I worked full-time over the summer at minimum wage for a local landscaper and his family, and that provided me a lot of invaluable work experience that has helped me later in life. I guess I was wondering what the impact of raising the minimum wage would be on that demographic, maybe 16, 17-year-olds who are just getting out in the workforce.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good question, and it's even possible that there ought to be, an exception in the increase in minimum wage for a certain age group. I'm certainly open to thinking about that. I don't think it's the case that simply raising the minimum age will, in fact, on balance, hurt poor people more than help them. There will probably be some loss of jobs. The economists differ, as Marvin said, but lots of economists think that won't be a serious problem. In Canada, the minimum wage is $11.50 or something, and it's working fine. So I think we could increase the minimum wage, maybe have some kind of additional category for younger teenagers. The other thing I would say is I don't want to put all the emphasis on the minimum wage to get to my goal of anybody who works full-time responsibly getting up to 125% of the poverty level and having health insurance. Remember, I talked about the earned income tax credit and other kinds of measures. And the reason you don't want to put all the emphasis on minimum wage is that at least some of the businesses in this country compete with business in China and Malaysia and so on. So the earned income tax credit has a different effect. We all contribute to that in our taxes, and that doesn't put an additional burden on businesses that are in fact competing with places in other countries. But Canada does quite well, and they're competing as much as we are.
You mentioned in your book, Just Generosity, on page 93, government should act as a last resort when other institutions do not or cannot care for the poor.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I would largely be in agreement with that. I think the question would be over the definition of when exactly that time occurs when it's the last resort. It strikes me that often it's been the first resort, and that's created a lot of our problems, or contributed to a lot of our problems.
It's a first resort for some people, but I mean, take the specific issue of food aid right now.
Okay.
We've got hundreds of thousands, I think, of Christians and Jews and Muslims, running food pantries. They could double and quadruple that and reduce the amount of government aid that was needed. But they're not somehow, and so 95% of all the food aid any month, is coming from the federal government. So to say that we ought to cut food stamps, the SNAP program, at this point in time, it seems to me, I need to be careful. It seems to me wrong-headed, to put it mildly. We need to do all we can to encourage and nurture more private activity. So your proposal for a larger tax benefit for private charity, I'm all in favor of that.
Well, let me just ask on that, on SNAP, particularly SNAP being supplemental nutrition, otherwise known as food stamps. The number has gone up from 5 years ago, 27 million to 47 million, a 20 million jump in those 5 years. Now, I agree that part of it is warranted by continued unemployment, economic difficulties, and so forth. But 27 million to 47 million in that period of time, that's a huge jump. Are you sure when Republicans talk about, well, maybe it shouldn't be 47 million, maybe it should be 45 million, that's still an $18 million person increase over this past 5 years. And I've seen in the world, we've had reporters documenting the way a lot of people are, who may be they may not be desiring to go into food stamps, but there's pressure put upon them. You must do this for the good of your community, and so forth and so on. Are you sure that that number from 27 million to 47 million is exactly the right number? Could it not be 45 million without those 2 million people? I just wonder, how do you know that any reduction from, say, 47 million to 45 million, again, still 18 million more than it was 5 years ago, how do you know that any reduction is inequitable, unjust, unbiblical?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I think to say is that the food stamp program worked exactly as it's supposed to in the Great Recession.
Okay.
Millions of people thrown out of work, into poverty. They needed help, and they got it. The Department of Agriculture has done a study and discovered that I think it's 50%, 50 or 60% of all the people who get food stamps stay on it for 8 months or less. They need it, they get it temporarily, they no longer need it, and they go off. There's also been studies that show that it's quite efficient and not a lot of fraud. Of course, there's some fraud. I've frankly never heard, and I live in communities where there are poor people. I've never heard of anybody pressuring people that didn't need food stamps to go on it for the good of the community.
Oh, I'll send you a couple of world articles that document that.
Yeah, I'm sure that there's a little bit out there, but it seems to me the weight of the evidence is that we desperately needed it, and so it expanded greatly. And what is it? The Office of Budget? No, it's not that office. One of the congressional budget office, I guess it is, has done studies and said that when the economy improves, there'll be the cost of the food aid program will go down. So that it may be that there's a million people that shouldn't get it, and a little cuts. I mean, if there are ways to tighten up the program so that it's not abused, I'm in favor of that. But the kind of huge slashes in the program that the Republicans in the House want to make seems to me fundamentally wrong-headed.
Okay. I guess I would wonder whether that, a 10% reduction of the increase, which is still an enormous increase of 18 million people in 5 years, if that's a slash, we see that. I mean, as a journalist, of course, I love words like slashing and so forth. And perhaps in hockey, you also slashed at times. No, I wouldn't.
No, I was a good Christian.
You were good, exactly. And so, anyway, questions? Any other? We have maybe a couple minutes left. Let's see, another question. Seeing no hands ardently raised at the moment.
Thank you both for a very illuminating conversation. Thanks for the audience. Thanks for those joining us on the webcast. Tomorrow at 12:20, Marvin Olasky will be interviewing Bill Murchison, former editor of the Dallas Morning News. But for now, please express your thanks to Marvin Olasky and Dr. Ron Sider.